The pounding on the door came like a storm that refused to pass. Not polite, not patient. Violent. Immani Brooks froze in the hallway, her heart slamming against her chest so hard it hurt. Behind her, Jaden clung to her shirt, his small hands shaking, his breath uneven. "Mom." "Who is it?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Another bang, louder this time. Ice opened the door. The word alone drained the color from her face. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. The moment the door cracked open, it flew wide, forcing her back a step as heavy boots crossed the threshold of her home like they owned it. Officer Kyle Mercer stood in front, tall, cold, a smile that didn't belong on a human face. His eyes slid past her and landed on Jaden. "Well," he said softly, almost amused. "You ready to leave with us, kid?" Jaden flinched. His grip tightened. Tears filled his eyes. "Don't touch him," Immani snapped, pulling her son behind her, her whole body shaking now. Neighbors' doors creaked open. Eyes watched. Phones lifted. Nobody moved. Mercer leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal. "We can take him right now," he whispered. Imani's breath caught. Her world tilted. "Please," she said, her voice barely there. "Not my son." Mercer smiled wider, and across the street, inside a dark SUV, someone watched in silence. If you're watching this right now, take a second and tell us where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. Because stories like this, stories about truth, fear, and the moment everything changes, connect people in ways nothing else can. And if this opening already has your heart racing, don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming next is something you don't want to miss. Immani Brooks had never been the kind of woman who panicked easily. Life had trained that out of her a long time ago, replacing it with something quieter, steadier, and far more dangerous under pressure. At 35, she had learned how to carry fear without letting it show, how to stand still when everything inside her wanted to run, and how to keep her voice level even when her heart felt like it was breaking apart inside her chest. But nothing in her life, not the long nights, not the cases she handled at work, not the things she had seen other people survive, had prepared her for the sound of someone threatening to take her child away right in front of her. She lived in a modest one-story home on a quiet street just outside Atlanta, the kind of neighborhood where people kept to themselves but still watched everything. The lawns were trimmed, the paint on the houses slightly worn but cared for, and the sidewalks carried the memory of children's laughter from years past. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't supposed to be. It was safe. Or at least it used to be. Immani had chosen this place because it felt like a fresh start, somewhere she and Jaden could exist without looking over their shoulders every 5 minutes, somewhere the past could stay where it belonged. That illusion had lasted just long enough for her to almost believe it. Jaden was 8 years old, small for his age, with eyes that seemed too old for a child. He had always been quiet, the kind of boy who observed before he spoke, who noticed things other children missed, and who carried those observations in silence long after the moment had passed. He loved his mother with a devotion that showed in the way he stayed close to her, in the way his hand always reached for hers without thinking, and in the way his face changed instantly when he sensed something was wrong. Right now, his fingers were dug into the fabric of her shirt, his body pressed against her back, as if proximity alone could keep him safe. And his breathing came in short, uneven bursts that told a story his words didn't need to. Immani worked as a social worker, spending her days navigating the complicated, often invisible lines between systems that were supposed to protect people and the reality of how those systems sometimes failed. She had seen families torn apart by paperwork, by mistakes, by decisions made by people who never had to live with the consequences. She had sat across from mothers who cried into their hands, fathers who stared at the floor in silence, and children who didn't understand why their world had suddenly shifted beneath their feet. She had promised herself more than once that no matter what happened, she would never let that become her story. And yet here she was, standing in her own doorway, her heart pounding, her son trembling behind her, and a man in front of her who spoke about taking her child like it was just another task on his list. The neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the noise and the tension that seemed to ripple through the air like a warning. Miss Loretta, who lived 2 houses down, stood on her porch, with her robe pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes sharp despite the late hour. She had lived on this street longer than anyone else, had seen families come and go, had watched children grow up and move away, and she had developed the kind of quiet awareness that came from years of paying attention. She didn't speak at first, didn't move closer, but her gaze stayed fixed on the scene unfolding in front of Immani's house, and there was something in her expression that suggested she understood more than she was letting on. A younger man across the street lifted his phone, recording from a distance, his face tense, as if he knew he was witnessing something that mattered, even if he didn't yet know why. What none of them noticed, or perhaps what they chose not to see, was the black SUV parked just beyond the reach of the streetlights, its engine running low, its presence almost blending into the darkness. It had been there before the pounding started, before the shouting, before the neighbors stepped outside. Inside, a man sat perfectly still, his posture relaxed in a way that only came from control, his eyes fixed on the house across the street. Malik Johnson didn't waste movement. He didn't waste attention either. Every detail in front of him mattered, every word, every gesture, every shift in tone. Beside him, Rex, a large, highly trained K9, sat alert, but silent. His ears slightly forward, his body tuned to the tension in the air. Dogs like Rex didn't need explanations. They read intent, emotion, and threat with an accuracy most humans couldn't match. And right now, everything about the scene unfolding in front of them had his full attention. Back at the doorway, Mercer took another step forward, his presence filling the space in a way that felt deliberate, calculated. He was a man who understood power, not the kind that came from respect, but the kind that came from fear, and he used it with a precision that suggested practice. Up close, the details of him became sharper, the clean lines of his uniform, the way his jaw tightened slightly when he spoke, and the faint glint of satisfaction in his eyes as he watched Immani struggle to keep herself together. He wasn't in a hurry. That was the part that made everything worse. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about control. "You seem nervous," he said, his tone light, almost conversational, as if they were discussing something trivial. "That usually means there's something to hide." Immani forced herself to meet his gaze even as her hands trembled at her sides. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, each word measured steady despite the storm building inside her. "You have no reason to be here." Mercer tilted his head slightly, studying her in a way that felt invasive. "Oh, we have a reason," he replied. "We always have a reason." His eyes flicked past her again, landing briefly on Jaden, and something in his expression shifted just for a second, just enough to send a cold wave through Immani's chest. And sometimes he added softly, "The reason is bigger than you think." Behind her, Jaden's grip tightened again, his small fingers digging in as if he could anchor himself to her. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, his fear no longer hidden. Immani reached back without looking her hand, finding his squeezing gently, a silent promise that she wasn't going to let go. But even as she did, her mind was racing, moving through possibilities, through memories, through things she had tried very hard not to think about for a long time. There were pieces of her past, she had buried things she had convinced herself were overdone, finished. But the way Mercer was looking at her, the way he spoke, the way he seemed to know exactly where to press it, didn't feel random. It didn't feel like a mistake. Across the street, inside the SUV, Malik's eyes narrowed slightly. He had seen this pattern before, had studied it, had followed it across months of quiet investigation that never made headlines and never got discussed in public. What was happening in front of him wasn't just enforcement. It wasn't procedure. It was something else entirely, something that operated in the gray areas where rules could be bent and truth could be hidden just long enough to get away with it. He shifted slightly in his seat, his hand resting briefly on Rex's back, feeling the steady strength beneath his palm. The dog's body tensed almost imperceptibly, a silent signal that matched what Malik was already thinking. Back at the door, Mercer's smile widened just a fraction, and then he said something that made the air feel heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Jaden Brooks," he said casually, as if the name meant nothing at all. "That's your son, right?" Immani's heart stopped. For one brief frozen second, everything inside her went completely still. Because she had never told him that name. The moment Mercer said Jaden's full name, something inside. Immani shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt final. Her fingers tightened around her son's hand, her knuckles turning pale as a cold realization slid through her chest, like ice. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't random. And whatever this was, it had been planned. She didn't react the way Mercer expected. She didn't gasp, didn't step back, didn't ask how he knew. Instead, she went still, her breathing slowing just enough to steady herself, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity that didn't match the fear still trembling in her body. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like Mercer always noticed shifts like that. It was part of what made them dangerous. "That's right." He continued, his tone casual, almost bored, like he was reading from a file he had memorized. 8 years old, attends Parkview Elementary, asthma diagnosis at 5, lives here with his mother. He paused, letting the words settle, letting the weight of them press down. Did I miss anything? Behind her, Jaden pressed closer, his small body shaking harder now, his breathing uneven. "Mom." He whispered again, his voice breaking this time, fear slipping through the cracks he had tried so hard to hold together. Immani didn't turn around, didn't let herself look at him, because she knew if she did, she might break in a way she couldn't recover from. Instead, she squeezed his hand, once firm and steady, the only signal she could give him right now. "You've made your point," she said quietly, her voice low but controlled, each word placed carefully. "Now tell me why you're here." Mercer's smile sharpened just a little. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until she could smell the faint trace of cologne on his uniform, something clean and expensive that didn't belong in a moment like this. "We're here," he said, his voice dropping, "because people like you don't just get to disappear and pretend the past doesn't exist." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because they were loud, but because they were precise, targeted. Behind him, the other officers began to move, spreading out with a quiet efficiency that felt rehearsed. One of them stepped past Mercer and into the house without asking, his boots heavy against the floor, his eyes scanning the room like he was already looking for something specific. Another followed, opening drawers, glancing at shelves, their movements quick but not chaotic. This wasn't a random search. It had structure, intent. "Hey." Immani snapped her composure, cracking just enough for anger to slip through. "You don't have permission to be in my home." The officer didn't respond. Didn't even look at her. Mercer did. And this time there was no attempt to soften anything in his expression. "Permission," he repeated, almost amused. "You think this is about permission?" He turned slightly, raising his voice just enough for the neighbors to hear. "We're conducting a lawful investigation, ma'am. If you have nothing to hide, This should be very simple. A few murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered outside. Phones were still raised. Eyes were still watching. But nobody stepped forward. Nobody challenged him. The social weight of the uniform, of the badge of the authority he carried, it pressed down on everyone there, holding them in place. Miss Loretta shifted on her porch, her brow furrowing as she leaned forward slightly, trying to catch every word. She had seen enough in her life to recognize when something didn't sit right, and this didn't sit right at all. But even she didn't move. Not yet. Immani felt the shift in the crowd, felt the way the narrative was already being shaped without her consent. That was part of it too. The performance. The control of perception. "You're lying," she said, her voice stronger now, cutting through the air with more force than before. "This isn't about any investigation." Mercer's eyes flickered just briefly before settling back into that same controlled calm. "Careful," he said softly. "Accusing a federal officer of lying isn't a great look. I don't care how it looks." She shot back, her chest tightening as adrenaline pushed her forward. "I care about what you're doing." For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched thick and heavy, filled only by the faint sounds of movement inside the house and the distant hum of a car engine idling somewhere down the street. Then Mercer leaned in just enough that only she could hear what he said next. "You should care about your son," he whispered. The words landed like a blow. Immani's breath caught her control, slipping for a fraction of a second as fear surged back to the surface. She felt it in her chest, in her throat, in the way her fingers tightened reflexively around Jaden's hand. That was what he wanted. That reaction. That weakness. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now, but sharper than before. "Don't bring him into this." Mercer straightened his expression, shifting back into something more neutral, as he turned slightly, addressing the scene again, the audience that had gathered without ever being invited. "We have reason to believe," he said, projecting his voice outward, "that this residence is connected to an ongoing matter involving falsified documentation and obstruction." The words were vague, intentionally so. Enough to plant doubt. Enough to make people question. Inside the house, something crashed, loud, sudden. Jaden flinched hard, a small cry escaping before he could stop it. Immani turned instinctively, her heart lurching, as she saw one of the officers pulling open a cabinet, too forcefully, items spilling out onto the floor. "Stop it," she shouted, stepping forward before catching herself, forcing her feet to stay where they were. She couldn't leave Jaden. She couldn't give Mercer that opening. Mercer watched her closely, his eyes tracking every movement, every reaction. "You seem very concerned about what we might find," he said, tilting his head slightly. "That usually means there's something worth finding. There's nothing in there but our life." She snapped, her voice breaking just slightly, now emotion bleeding through despite her efforts to contain it. "You're tearing apart my home for no reason." "No reason," he echoed, and this time there was something darker in his tone. "We've been watching you for weeks, Ms. Brooks." He let the name hang there again, deliberate, controlled. "Everything you do, everywhere you go, every person you talk to." The words hit harder than anything he had said so far. Immani felt it in her stomach, a cold, sinking realization that spread outward, touching every part of her at once. Weeks. He said weeks like it was nothing, like it was normal, but it wasn't. Because if he had been watching her, then this wasn't just about her. It was about something she had tried very hard to keep buried. Her mind moved fast now, connecting pieces she hadn't wanted to connect before pulling threads she had left alone. The SUV, the feeling of being watched, the way certain things hadn't added up. And beneath all of it, something else. something quieter, more dangerous. She shifted slightly, just enough to press her arm closer to her side, where the small, barely noticeable pouch sat beneath the fabric of her jacket. Inside it, the USB drive rested, light but heavy with everything it carried. Evidence. Truth. The kind of thing people got hurt over. The kind of thing people killed over. Mercer's eyes flicked downward for a fraction of a second, then back up as if he had noticed the movement without fully understanding it. "Not yet. You can make this easy," he said, his voice softening again, almost persuasive now. "Cooperate, answer our questions. Hand over anything relevant." He paused, then added just loud enough for Jaden to hear. "Otherwise, we may have to take additional steps." Jaden's grip tightened again, his small body pressing closer, his fear no longer hidden, no longer controlled. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling, tears finally spilling over. Immani closed her eyes for one brief second, just enough to gather herself to pull everything back into place. When she opened them again, something had changed. The fear was still there. The shaking hadn't stopped, but underneath it, there was something else now, something steadier. "This isn't enforcement," she said slowly, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension in a way that made Mercer's expression flicker for the smallest fraction of a second. "This is something else." Mercer's smile returned thin and sharp. "You're not in a position to decide that." "No," she replied, her eyes locking onto his again, unflinching now despite everything. "But I am in a position to know." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Heavier, charged. And for the first time since he arrived, Mercer didn't speak immediately. Because something in the way she said that didn't sound like fear. It sounded like a warning. For a brief second, after Immani's words settled into the air, the entire scene seemed to pause. Not because anything had changed on the surface. Officers were still moving through her home drawers, still opening objects, still shifting, but because something underneath it all had tilted. Mercer felt it. He didn't show it, not fully, but it was there, a faint tightening along his jaw, a flicker behind his eyes that didn't belong to the calm control he had worn so easily just moments before. He didn't like being challenged. Not like that. Not in front of witnesses. "Careful," he said again, quieter this time, but sharper, his voice carrying just enough weight to make it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "You're starting to sound like someone who doesn't understand her situation." Immani didn't answer right away. She was listening now, not just to his words, but to everything else. The movement inside her house, the breathing behind her, the distant hum of that engine still running somewhere down the street. Her heart was still racing, still pounding hard enough to make her chest ache, but her mind had shifted into something colder, something more focused. Fear was still there. It just wasn't in control anymore. Behind her, Jaden's grip tightened again, his small fingers digging in as another loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Something glass shattered this time, the sharp sound slicing through the tension like a blade. He flinched hard at a small cry escaping before he could stop it. "Hey!" Immani snapped, turning her head just enough to shout past Mercer. "That's enough! Stop breaking things!" One of the officers inside glanced toward the door, then away again, continuing what he was doing without a word. Cabinets opened. Footsteps moved. The deliberate destruction continued, not chaotic, not reckless, but intentional. Searching, pushing, pressing. Mercer didn't even look back. "If there's nothing to hide," he said almost casually, "then there's nothing to worry about. That's not how this works." Immani shot back, her voice rising despite herself. "You don't just come into someone's home and That's exactly how this works, he cut in, his tone snapping for the first time, the calm mask slipping just enough to reveal something harsher underneath. You don't decide how this works. We do. The words hung there heavy and absolute. Outside, the small crowd shifted again. Someone whispered. Someone else kept recording. The glow of phone screens reflected off tense faces, capturing everything, preserving it in real time. But still, no one stepped forward. Miss Loretta leaned further over her porch railing. Now her lips pressed together, her eyes moving between Mercer, Immani, and the officers inside the house. She had seen authority abused before. She had seen people pushed too far while everyone else stood by. Her fingers tightened around the wood of the railing, her knuckles whitening slightly, but she still didn't move. Not yet. Not without knowing exactly what she was stepping into. Back at the doorway, Mercer took another step closer, his presence now fully invading Immani's space. "Let's stop wasting time," he said, his voice dropping again, quieter but more dangerous. "Where is it?" Immani blinked once, slowly. Where is what? His eyes held hers for a long moment, searching, measuring. Then he leaned in again, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath against her skin. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he whispered. For a split second, something inside her chest tightened. Not panic, not yet, but recognition. He knows. The thought hit hard and fast, sending a wave of cold through her body that she forced herself not to show. Her hand shifted slightly again, instinctively brushing against the inside of her jacket where the small pouch rested. The USB drive. The only thing she had kept. The only thing she couldn't afford to lose. Mercer's eyes flicked downward again, quicker this time, sharper. There, he saw the movement. He straightened slowly, a different kind of smile forming now, less amused, more certain. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. Immani's heart kicked hard against her ribs, but she didn't step back. Didn't reach for the pouch. Didn't give him anything more to read. "You're making a mistake," she said instead, her voice low, steady in a way that cost her more effort than anything she had done so far. "Whatever you think you're looking for, it's not here." Mercer tilted his head, studying her again, but now there was something else in his gaze. Not just control, not just confidence, anticipation. "We'll see about that," he replied. Inside the house, footsteps grew heavier, faster. One of the officers reappeared in the hallway, moving toward the front with purpose. "Nothing in the living room," he said briefly. "Checking the back." "Keep going," Mercer replied without looking away from Immani. Jaden shifted behind her, his breathing ragged now, his fear no longer contained. "Mom, I'm scared," he whispered, his voice breaking fully this time, tears streaking down his face. That did it. Something inside Immani snapped, not loudly, not violently, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. She turned slightly, just enough to see him, just enough to take in the fear in his eyes, the way his small body shook, the way he was trying so hard to be brave and failing. "I know, baby," she said softly, her voice gentler now, even as her heart ached. "I know. I've got you." She reached back, pulling him closer with one arm, her body instinctively shifting to shield him more fully from the men in front of her. It was a small movement, but it was everything. Mercer watched it, and something in his expression hardened. "That's touching," he said, his tone flat now, the mockery gone. "Really? It is." He paused, then added louder this time for everyone to hear, "But it doesn't change what's about to happen." Immani turned back to him slowly. "And what exactly is that?" she asked. For the first time since he arrived, Mercer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her again, directly at Jaden. And then he did something that made the air feel like it had been sucked out of the entire street. He reached forward, not toward Immani, toward the boy. Jaden froze instantly, his small body going rigid, his eyes wide with pure, unfiltered fear as Mercer's hand closed around his arm. No, Immani shouted the word tearing out of her before she could stop it, her entire body moving forward on instinct as she grabbed Jaden back, pulling him hard against her. The movement was sudden, desperate, raw. For a split second, everything collided. Fear, anger, instinct. Mercer didn't let go immediately. His grip tightened just enough to make a point, just enough to show he could. "You need to cooperate," he said, his voice low again, dangerous now in a way it hadn't been before. "Or this gets a lot harder for him." Jaden let out a small, broken sound, his tears falling faster now, his hands clutching at his mother, as if she were the only solid thing left in the world. Immani's chest rose and fell rapidly, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, her temples, her fingertips. For a moment, everything blurred: the crowd, the officers, the house behind her. All she could see was her son. All she could hear was his crying. And then through it all, another sound cut in. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. A car door opening. Across the street, in the shadows where the SUV had been waiting, a figure stepped out into the dim light, his silhouette calm, controlled, and entirely unhurried. Back at the doorway, Mercer didn't notice. Not yet, but Immani did, and something in her eyes shifted again. Because whatever was about to happen next, this moment had already gone further than Mercer realized. Immani saw the figure step out of the SUV, but she did not let herself look twice. She couldn't. Not with Mercer's hand still too close to Jaden, not with the officers still inside her house, not with half the neighborhood watching her life crack open under porch lights and phone cameras. Any sign that she recognized something, any flicker of relief, any shift in her breathing could ruin everything. So she held still. She kept her face tight with fear and anger and let Mercer believe he still controlled the night. But inside, something else had begun to move. Hope was too soft a word for it. This felt sharper than hope. More dangerous. It felt like the first breath after being held underwater too long. Because if the man stepping out of that SUV was who she thought he was, then this night was no longer happening on Mercer's terms, no matter how hard he tried to pretend otherwise. Jaden's small body shook against hers. She could feel every frightened breath, every tremor in his shoulders, every pulse of panic in the way he clung to her. She bent slightly, just enough to press her cheek briefly against the top of his head. "Stay behind me," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. "No matter what happens, you stay behind me." "Do you hear me?" Jaden nodded against her, though his crying hadn't fully stopped. "Mom?" He whispered again, and the word came out thin and broken like something fragile. "I know," she said softly. "I know." Mercer stepped back half a pace, not because he wanted to, but because he had already made his point and knew it. His eyes stayed on her, watching, calculating, waiting for her to make a mistake. "This is your last chance to make things easier," he said. "Hand it over." Immani lifted her head slowly. "You keep saying that," she replied, her voice quieter now, but more controlled than before. "Maybe you should tell me what you think I have." A smile pulled at the corner of Mercer's mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're smart enough to know," he said. "That's what makes this whole thing so unfortunate." Unfortunate. The word almost made her laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because the cruelty of men like Mercer always came wrapped in language like that, cool, detached, as if destruction were just an administrative inconvenience, as if terror could be filed under procedure. From inside the house, one of the officers called out, "Nothing in the bedroom. Closets clear." Mercer didn't look away from her. "Keep going." Immani felt the pouch beneath her jacket again without touching it. Light, small, quiet. The USB drive had no right to carry as much weight as it did, but that was the thing about truth. Sometimes the smallest object in a room could be the heaviest. She had almost destroyed it 3 times. Once in the bathroom sink at 2 in the morning with her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold a lighter. Once behind a grocery store dumpster after driving around for an hour trying to convince herself that getting rid of it would make everything stop. And once, most recently, when Jaden had come into the kitchen half asleep and asked with the simple cruelty only children can carry without meaning to, "Why do you always look scared now?" She had kept it anyway. Because some truths did not disappear just because they were dangerous. Because some silences were more expensive than fear. And because 2 years earlier, on a night, she still replayed in pieces she had seen something she was never supposed to see. Back then, her life had looked almost normal from the outside. She was still doing community outreach work, still driving across Atlanta to check on families who had slipped between systems, still trying to believe that if she worked hard enough, cared enough, stayed careful enough, she and Jaden could build a future that didn't feel like survival every single day. It had been late when she got the call from a woman named Elena. The voice on the other end had been ragged, terrified, barely coherent. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "They're going to move her. They're going to move her tonight." At first, Immani hadn't understood. Elena was undocumented, one of many women she had quietly helped find emergency shelter, food, medical appointments, and legal aid over the years. She had bruises she always explained away, and a way of scanning every room like she was measuring escape routes. Immani had learned not to press too hard, too fast. Trust came slowly to people who had been hunted by life. That night, Elena had finally said the part that mattered. "It's not just them," she had whispered, crying so hard she could barely breathe. "It's officers, too. They take money. They move girls. They say nobody will believe us." Immani had gone cold all over. She had driven to the address Elena gave her, an old service lot behind a shuttered warehouse district on the south side, because that was who she was back then. Someone who still believed doing the right thing fast enough could stop bad things from happening. She had parked 2 streets away and called the emergency number she was supposed to call, but no one answered. Then she heard shouting, then a van door slamming, then a child crying somewhere in the dark. She should have stayed in the car. She knew that now, but she hadn't. She had moved closer, hidden behind stacked pallets and rusted chain-link fencing, her phone and her hand camera recording, without her fully deciding to record. The images were shaky. The audio was worse. But the voices were clear enough. Men talking money. Names. Routes. A girl begging. Another voice telling her to shut up. And then, under the yellow wash of a broken security light, she had seen 2 uniformed officers standing near the van. One of them had been Kyle Mercer. Not exactly as he was now. Younger by a little. Leaner, but unmistakable. The same cold stillness. The same controlled contempt. He had taken an envelope from a man in a dark jacket, counted nothing, pocketed everything, and then turned as if sensing movement somewhere in the dark. Immani still remembered the exact feeling of that moment. Her heart stopping, her knees weakening, her whole body going hot and cold at once. She had pulled back too late. A loose piece of metal fencing had scraped loudly against the concrete. One of the men shouted. Footsteps came fast. She ran. She had not made it back to her car before hearing the gunshot. Not at her. Into the air, maybe. Or maybe not. She never found out. She only knew she had driven home with both hands locked to the steering wheel so tight her wrists hurt for days afterward, and Jaden, who had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for her, woke when she came in and stared at her face for one long, silent second before asking, "What happened?" Nothing, she had lied. But children knew. They always knew. The next day she found Elena. Barely. Bruised, terrified, ready to disappear again. The woman gave her a folded piece of paper with names and drop locations, then said she wanted no part of the police, no reports, no courtrooms, no promises. "They wear badges," she whispered. Who do you tell when the bad men wear badges? That question had sat inside Immani ever since. For weeks, she had done nothing. Then a man had contacted her quietly through a legal advocate she trusted. He had not introduced himself fully. He had only said she was not crazy, that what she had seen mattered, and that if she still had the video, there were people who needed to see it. He told her never to say his name on the phone, never to keep everything in one place, never to assume she was safe just because things were quiet. That was the first time she heard the name Malik Johnson, not from him, from someone else. Carefully. Like a door opening only 1 inch. Since then, her life had become a series of small precautions. Different routes home. Curtains always closed after dark. A pouch under her jacket. A copy hidden somewhere else. And above all, Jaden kept close. Too close, maybe. Too aware. He had been in the back seat the night she fled that warehouse, half awake beneath a blanket, and although she had told herself he didn't understand what he heard, children carried fear in ways adults often missed. Sometimes he woke from sleep crying. Sometimes he went quiet at loud knocks. Sometimes he asked if bad men could find people even after they moved. Tonight had answered that question. Mercer lifted a hand, snapping her out of the memory. "You with me?" he asked, his voice silk over a blade. Immani looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time since he arrived, her fear no longer felt directionless. It had shape now. History. Meaning. This wasn't a raid. This was cleanup. And Mercer was not here to investigate anything. He was here to erase something. From the street behind him, she heard the soft click of a car door fully closing. Slow footsteps followed. Calm, measured, certain. Mercer still hadn't turned around, but Immani knew. And deep inside her chest, beneath the fear, beneath the shaking, beneath the ache of holding herself together in front of her son and her neighbors, and the man who wanted to bury her truth, something hardened into place. If tonight was the night everything surfaced, then she was done acting like she didn't know what this really was. She lifted her chin slightly and said very quietly, "This isn't about documents." Mercer's eyes narrowed. Immani's voice did not tremble when she finished. "It's about what I saw." The words landed between them with a force far greater than their volume. Immani did not shout them. She did not throw them like a threat. She said them quietly, almost wearily, as if she were finally too tired to keep pretending this was anything other than what it was. That made them more dangerous. Mercer's expression changed at once. Not fully. Not enough for anyone in the crowd to understand it. But Immani saw it. The flicker. The brief tightening around his eyes. The cold calculations snapping into a different shape. For the first time that night, he looked less like a man performing power and more like a man measuring risk. "I don't know what story you've told yourself," he said, his tone flattening, the softness gone now. "But this is exactly why people like you end up in trouble. You see things. You imagine things. Then you convince yourself you matter." The insult was deliberate. So was the phrasing. He wanted the neighbors to hear it. He wanted them to absorb the message that she was unstable, dramatic, difficult. a woman making noise, a woman looking for attention. Immani had seen that trick before. She had watched institutions use it on grieving mothers, exhausted wives, battered women and children whose fear was more inconvenient than believable. First you frighten them, then you discredit them, then you let the crowd do the rest. But she was done helping him build that version of the night. "You took money," she said, her voice low and clear, "at the warehouse on Red Clay Road. You stood beside that van and you took money." The silence that followed was immediate and total. Even the officers inside the house seemed to slow for a second, as if the air itself had changed. Mercer stared at her. Behind her, Jaden's crying softened into small, broken breaths. The kind that come after terror has exhausted itself into trembling silence. Across the street, phones stayed raised. Nobody spoke. Mercer smiled then, but it was a different smile now. Smaller, meaner. A smile with no performance left in it at all. That he said softly was a very stupid thing to say. Immani's heart hammered so hard it made her chest hurt, but she did not look away. Truth usually sounds stupid to people who built their lives on lies. He moved before anyone expected it. One step. Fast. Close enough that she instinctively pulled Jaden harder behind her. His hand shot out not to strike her, but to clamp around her wrist with a grip so sudden and hard that pain flashed up her arm. "Enough," he hissed, his voice no longer for the crowd. "You've had your moment." Immani tried to pull back, but his grip tightened. Tears sprang to her eyes from the pressure, but anger rose faster than pain. "Let go of me. Hand it over. I don't know what you're talking about." His face came closer, his eyes flat and bright, with something ugly and controlled. "You keep touching that jacket like it's a prayer. Hand it over." Jaden let out a frightened sound. Mom Immani twisted sharply, trying to wrench her wrist free, but Mercer used the movement against her and pulled her a half step forward. The pouch beneath her jacket shifted. He felt it. She saw the exact instant he knew. "There it is," he whispered, and then everything accelerated. He shoved her backward with enough force to stagger her off balance and snapped grabbed the kid. One of the officers moved immediately. Too immediately. He stepped around Mercer and reached for Jaden with the automatic obedience of someone who had stopped distinguishing orders from conscience a long time ago. Jaden screamed. Not a loud grown-up scream. A child's scream. High, terrified, helpless. The kind of sound that tears through a street and leaves nothing untouched. No. Immani lunged, catching Jaden by the shoulders and trying to yank him behind her, but the officer had already gotten a hand on the boy's arm. For one impossible second, Jaden was between them, small body twisting, crying, shaking so hard he could barely stay upright. "Mom, Mom, don't let them take me." That sentence hit the whole street like a physical blow. Immani heard herself make a sound she would not later remember making. It came from somewhere below words, below thought, below dignity. Pure instinct, pure terror. She threw herself forward and wrapped both arms around her son, pulling him against her chest with desperate force. The officer cursed under his breath as the movement broke his hold, but Mercer stepped in instantly, grabbing Immani by the shoulder and trying to wrench her backward. "Stop resisting," he barked loud enough for every phone camera to hear, every neighbor to record, every future lie to have its soundtrack. Immani did not stop. She couldn't. Jaden was sobbing against her now, his hands clutching at her shirt so tightly the fabric stretched. She felt his tears on her neck, his breath coming in panicked bursts, his whole body shaking with the terrible knowledge children should never have to carry. That adults with power can become monsters without warning. "Please," she cried, and the word tore at her throat on the way out. "Please, he's just a child," Mercer laughed. It was not a big laugh, not dramatic, not theatrical. Just one sharp, cruel sound of amusement that made Miss Loretta's face go hard from across the street and caused one woman in the crowd to lower her phone with sudden disgust. That laugh did more damage than any shouted threat could have done. It stripped away the last excuse anyone might have had for misunderstanding what kind of man he was. "He should have had a better mother," Mercer said coldly. Jaden heard it. Immani felt him hear it in the way his body curled tighter into hers, not just with fear now but with hurt. Deep, raw hurt. Children always know when cruelty is aimed at the people they love. Something hot and blinding surged through her. "Don't you say another word to him." Mercer grabbed for her jacket. Not subtle anymore, not pretending. His fingers hooked into the fabric near the inner seam where the pouch sat hidden, and Immani knew in one crashing second that if he got it, everything was over. Not just for her, for Elena. For the other girls whose names were stored in that evidence. For the silent chain of truth that had made it this far only because nobody had managed to bury it completely. So she did the only thing left. She shoved the pouch downward with one hand, hard and fast, letting it drop through the torn lining she had cut herself weeks earlier for exactly this possibility. It slid along the inside of her coat and fell near her hip. Jaden felt it hit against him. His eyes darted down through tears. For 1 second, mother and son looked at each other. He understood. Not fully. Not the details. But enough. Immani tightened one arm around him and whispered so low only he could hear pocket. The boy's face crumpled with fear, but beneath that fear there was something else too, the old sad alertness he had learned too young. His small hand moved shakily, hidden between their bodies, and disappeared into the fold of her coat. Mercer saw movement, but not meaning. He yanked at the jacket again. "Where is it?" I said. Immani gasped, forcing the words out through pain and panic. "Let go of my son." Around them the street had transformed. The crowd was no longer passively watching. People were speaking now. Not loudly all at once, but in shocked, fractured pieces. "That's a child. Why are they touching him? Somebody do something. Oh my God." Miss Loretta came down off her porch at last, one careful step after another, her voice shaking with anger. "You need to take your hands off that baby." Mercer ignored her. Or tried to. Because the sound that came next cut through everything. A low growl, deep, controlled, close. Every head turned. At the edge of the yard, just beyond the spill of porch light, a large K9 stood rigid beside a tall man in a dark jacket. The dog's body was still, except for the tension coiled through it, ears forward, eyes locked directly on Mercer. The man holding the lead looked calm in the way storms sometimes look calm right before they break. Mercer froze, truly froze. His hand was still clutching Immani's jacket, but all motion stopped in him at once, as if some buried instinct had finally recognized danger. The man's voice came next, low and level and impossible to mistake. "Take your hands off them." Nobody moved. The dog growled again, and this time even Mercer looked afraid. The command did not come out loud. It did not need to. The man standing at the edge of the yard spoke in the kind of controlled voice that made loud men suddenly remember they were not as untouchable as they liked to believe. Every eye on the street shifted toward him at once. Porch lights caught the sharp lines of his face, the dark jacket, the badge hanging low enough to matter and high enough not to need explanation. Beside him, the K9 stood rigid, muscles tense beneath glossy fur teeth. Not bared, but close enough to the surface for everyone to understand the warning. Mercer's hand loosened first. Not because he wanted to. Because instinct got there before pride. He stepped back half a pace from Immani and Jaden, and that single movement changed the whole shape of the night. Immani pulled her son tighter against her immediately, her body curving around him protectively, her breath shaking now with the aftershock of adrenaline and fear. Jaden buried his face in her shoulder, still crying, but softer now, the way a child cries when terror has not ended yet. But something in the air has shifted just enough to let hope inside. The man moved forward one measured step, Rex beside him, silent now, except for the low, almost inaudible sound still vibrating in his chest. "I said," he repeated, calm as stone, "take your hands off them." Mercer stared. Whatever practiced arrogance had carried him through the last 20 minutes was still on his face, but it was thinner now, stretched tight over something far less stable. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, trying for contempt and not quite landing it. The man stopped within the reach of the porch light and let the badge catch the glow. "Special Agent Malik Johnson," he said. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The reaction rippled outward in silence before it found words. A few gasps. Someone whispering FBI under their breath. The younger man across the street nearly lowered his phone in shock, then thought better of it and kept recording. Miss Loretta, now at the edge of Immani's walkway, put one hand flat against her chest, her eyes widening, but never leaving Mercer's face. For the first time all night, Mercer did not immediately speak. Malik's gaze moved once over the scene and took in everything, the broken line of Immani's breath. Jaden's wet face pressed into his mother's shoulder, the officers spread through the house and front yard, the phones raised in the dark, Mercer's posture tight with fury and calculation. He saw the torn fabric at Immani's jacket. He saw the red mark already forming on her wrist. He saw enough. "Step away from the residence," Malik said. One of the officers inside the house appeared in the hallway, confused by the sudden shift in tone outside. He looked from Mercer to Malik to the dog and stopped dead. Another officer came in behind him, slower, reading the room faster, his jaw tightening as recognition set in. They knew now that whatever this operation had been supposed to look like from the outside, it no longer belonged to Mercer. Mercer gave a short, humorless laugh, recovering just enough to try again. "You don't get to walk onto my scene and start issuing orders." Malik's face did not change. "This stopped being your scene the second you put your hands on a child while executing an unlawful search." He paused, then added with the same unsettling calm, "You need to think very carefully about what you say next." Mercer squared his shoulders as if posture alone could reverse what was happening. "We have authority here," "No," Malik said. "You had the illusion of it." Rex stepped forward half a pace, not because Malik pulled him, but because something in Mercer had set him off again. The dog's stare locked hard on the officer's face, and Mercer's body reacted before his pride could stop it. His shoulders tensed. His weight shifted back. Tiny movements. Human ones. The kind fear always makes before the mouth admits anything. Immani saw it. For the first time since Mercer had arrived at her door, she saw fear in him. Not uncertainty. Not irritation. Fear. That mattered. Jaden lifted his face slightly from her shoulder. His eyes red and swollen, and looked toward Malik, then at Rex. The dog's size might have terrified him under any other circumstances, but children recognized protection faster than adults sometimes did. He clung to his mother a little less desperately. Mercer noticed that too, and it seemed to make him angrier. "You're interfering in an active federal action." Malik gave him a long look, the kind adults give when a lie is too weak to deserve immediate correction. "There is no active federal action on file for this address, under your authority." He shifted his gaze briefly toward the officers still inside the house. "Which means every second this continues adds another layer to your problem. The sentence landed with weight. One of the officers in the hallway lowered his eyes first. Another took a step back from the kitchen, as if distance might later become denial. Immani's pulse was still fast, but her mind had sharpened again. She tightened one arm around Jaden and kept the other low between their bodies, subtly pressing once against his side. A signal, a question. The boy, still shaking, gave the smallest nod. The pouch was in his pocket now. Safe for the moment. Safe because Mercer had underestimated the child he tried to use as leverage. Malik turned toward Immani without fully turning his back on Mercer. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice easing by 1 degree, not soft exactly, but human. "Are you hurt?" She swallowed. "My wrist." Her voice was rough. "And my son." "I'm okay," Jaden whispered quickly, though he was obviously not okay. His whole body was still trembling. Tears clung to his lashes. His face was blotched red from crying. But he had heard the question and answered anyway, the way children do when they think being brave might help the adults hold everything together. Malek's eyes flicked to Jaden, took him in, and then returned to Mercer with something colder than anger now. "You touched the boy." Mercer lifted his chin. He was obstructing. Miss Loretta made a sound of disbelief from the walkway. That baby wasn't obstructing anything. Several voices murmured agreement from the crowd. The mood had changed. It was no longer caution holding them still. It was outrage beginning to find courage. Mercer heard it and hated it. He took one step forward, but Rex's growl rose instantly louder, now unmistakable. The sound stopped Mercer mid-motion. Every person on the street felt it in their spine. Malik did not even glance down at the dog. That would be a mistake. Mercer's jaw flexed. "You threatening me?" "No," Malik said. "I'm advising you." The difference between the two hung in the air like a blade. One of the ICE officers finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Sir, maybe we should call this in." Mercer whipped his head around. "Stand down." The officer hesitated. That hesitation told everyone watching more than words could have. Mercer no longer had his people with him in the same way he had a few minutes ago. Authority built on fear works only until a stronger form of accountability arrives. Malik's presence had done more than interrupt. It had exposed the weakness beneath Mercer's command. Malik's eyes shifted briefly toward the officer who had spoken. "What's your name?" The man blinked. "Officer Daniel Ruiz." Officer Ruiz. Malik said, "Walk everyone out of the house. Now." Mercer snapped Ruiz, but it was too late. Ruiz had already made the choice. He turned, looked at the others, and said with a stiffness that made clear he was trying to save what he could of himself, "Everybody out. Now." One by one they started moving. Boots retreated from the kitchen, from the hallway, from the back rooms. An older woman in the crowd began muttering, "Lord have mercy," under her breath. Someone else said he knew. He knew this whole time. The younger man across the street whispered to his phone, narrating through shock. "The FBI just showed up. Y'all, the FBI just showed up." Mercer stood rigid in the middle of it, the center of a collapse he could no longer stop. Malik stepped fully into the yard, now Rex at his side, and stopped within clear sight of everyone present. His eyes stayed on Mercer as he said the words that finally stripped the last illusion away. "You picked the wrong house," he said, "and the wrong woman." Mercer's face drained just slightly, because beneath the anger, beneath the posturing, beneath the frantic recalculations happening behind his eyes, he understood something now that he had not understood when he first pounded on Immani Brooks's door. This night had not gone off script. It had walked him straight into one. For a few seconds after Malik's words settled into the air, nobody moved. Not the officers stepping out of the house, not the neighbors lining the sidewalk, not even Mercer, who stood rooted in place as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not correct. The silence stretched thick and heavy, and in that silence something irreversible began to unfold. Malik did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Control radiated from him in a way that made noise unnecessary. "Officer Mercer," he said evenly, "you are now part of an active federal investigation." Mercer let out a short, incredulous breath, something between a laugh and a scoff. "You don't get to just say that and make it real." Malik's expression did not change. "We've been making it real for months." The words landed like a slow detonation. Immani felt it in her chest, a tightening that wasn't fear this time, but recognition, confirmation of something she had suspected, but never fully allowed herself to believe. Behind her, Jaden shifted slightly, his small hand gripping the fabric of her shirt, still afraid, still shaken, but listening now in a way that told her he understood something important was happening. Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Months," he repeated, his tone carefully controlled, but the edges were fraying now. "You expect me to believe that Malik took one step closer, just enough to close the distance without escalating the tension beyond what it already was. I don't expect you to believe anything he said. I expect you to listen." From the SUV behind him, another agent stepped out carrying a slim black case. He moved quickly, but without urgency, the kind of pace that came from knowing the moment was already under control. When he reached Malik's side, he opened the case and handed over a tablet. Malik didn't look at it immediately. He kept his eyes on Mercer. "You've been under surveillance?" He continued for coordinated activity involving unauthorized detentions, falsified documentation, and financial transactions connected to trafficking routes, operating through multiple jurisdictions. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The word trafficking landed hard. People shifted, phones angled closer. The atmosphere changed again, this time with a sharp edge of anger cutting through the earlier uncertainty. Mercer shook his head once, a quick, dismissive motion that didn't quite match the tension in his body. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "You better be ready to back it up." Malik finally glanced down at the tablet, tapped once, and then turned it outward. "Play it," he said. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across Mercer's face. For a split second, he didn't react. Then the audio hit. A voice. His voice. "That's not my problem. You want the route cleared, you pay for it." Same as last time. Another voice, distorted slightly but clear enough to carry meaning. And the girl, pause. Then Mercer again. "She goes where she's told. Nobody's looking." The clip cut. Silence slammed back into place. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Someone in the crowd gasped loudly. Another voice whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. Miss Loretta's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with something between shock and fury. Immani didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt locked in place, her heart pounding in a way that made everything around her seem distant and too close at the same time. She had heard that voice before. Not the exact words, not that exact moment, but the tone, the certainty, the casual cruelty. Hearing it now out loud, undeniable, made something inside her chest loosen and tighten all at once. Mercer stared at the screen, his face gone still in a way that was almost unnatural. "That's edited," he said finally, the words coming too fast, too sharp. "Out of context. You can't." Malik cut him off. "There's more." He tapped the screen again. This time the video came up. Grainy. Dim. The yellow wash of a broken light casting long shadows across a cracked concrete lot. A van? A man in a dark jacket? an envelope changing hands, and then stepping into the edge of the frame, clear enough to recognize even through the poor quality Kyle Mercer. The footage froze there. No sound now, no movement, just the image. Mercer's image. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the whispers started. That's him. That's really him. He said it wasn't, look at his face. Mercer took a step back. Just one. But it was enough. That's not proof. He said, his voice lower, now tighter, the confidence cracking in real time. You don't have context. You don't know what that was. Malik's gaze didn't waver. We know exactly what it was, he said. We also know where the money went, who it went to, and how many times this exact pattern repeated under your supervision. Another agent moved forward, holding a small stack of printed documents. Financial records, he said, handing them to Malik. Cross-referenced. Malik didn't look down. He held them out toward Mercer instead. You want context, he said. Here it is. Mercer didn't take them. His hands had started to shake. It was subtle, barely visible unless you were looking for it. But Immani saw it. She saw the exact moment the man who had stood in her doorway like he owned her life realized that the ground beneath him was no longer solid, that the control he had relied on had slipped into something else entirely. Behind him, one of the ICE officers shifted again this time, stepping back, creating distance. Another followed, then another. The separation was quiet, but unmistakable. Mercer noticed. Of course he noticed. Don't he? Snapped his voice sharp, turning toward them. Don't you step away from me like you don't know what this is? Nobody answered. Nobody moved closer. Malik spoke again, his tone unchanged. You're done giving orders tonight. The words hit harder than anything else he had said. Mercer turned back slowly, his jaw tight. His eyes burning now with something that wasn't just anger anymore. There was fear there. Real fear. The kind that comes when a man realizes the system he thought protected him is no longer on his side. This isn't over, he said, the sentence more reflex than strategy now. You think this ends here? Malik took one final step forward, closing the space completely, Rex at his side, silent and watchful. No, he said. It doesn't end here. He paused, letting the weight of what came next settle into the air. It ends with you in custody. The street went completely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Immani felt Jaden shift against her, his grip loosening slightly, his breathing slowing just enough to tell her the worst of the immediate fear had passed. She tightened her arms around him anyway, her body still trembling from everything that had happened, from everything that was still happening. Mercer's eyes moved from Malik to the agents behind him, to the officers who had already begun to distance themselves, to the crowd that no longer looked at him with hesitation, but with something much colder. Judgment. For the first time all night, he had nowhere left to direct the narrative, nowhere left to hide. And for the first time in a very long time, he had no power left at all. The shift in power was no longer subtle. It was visible now in the way Mercer stood, in the way the officers near him avoided his eyes, in the way the crowd that had once watched in frightened silence now looked at him with open disgust. His authority had not been taken from him all at once. It had cracked, splintered, and then collapsed in front of everyone. That public unraveling was its own kind of punishment, and everybody on that street could feel it. Malik held out one hand, calm and steady. Turn around. Mercer did not move. For a brief second, it looked like he might try one last performance, one last bluff, one last desperate act of intimidation to hold the night together by force. His jaw flexed. His chest rose and fell hard. His eyes darted once toward the street, once toward the officers behind him, once toward the dark edges of the yard where escape would be useless and stupid. He was calculating, looking for a way out. But the worst part for him, the part that finally broke through the pride and rage, was that there wasn't one. "This is political," he said, the words coming out strained, less like an argument and more like something he needed to say for himself. "You're making this political." Malik didn't blink. "No. You did that when you used a badge like a hunting license." That sentence settled over the crowd with the kind of force that makes people remember it later. Phones stayed raised. Someone whispered, "That's right," under their breath. Miss Loretta took another step closer, no longer hesitating, her lined face tight with anger that had matured into clarity. Mercer laughed once, but there was no strength in it now. "You think she's innocent?" He jerked his chin toward Immani, turning what little of the crowd he still could toward her. "You think she hasn't lied? You think she hasn't hidden things?" Immani stood straighter, even with Jaden pressed against her, and her body still shaking from everything that had happened. Her wrist throbbed, her shoulder burned where he had grabbed her. Her throat ached from fear, from shouting, from forcing herself not to break in front of her son. But when Mercer tried to drag her back into his version of the story, something inside her settled instead of splintering. "She hid evidence from you," Malik said before she could answer. "That was the smartest thing she did." Mercer's face changed, just slightly, but it was enough. Enough for the crowd to see he was no longer the man controlling the moment. Enough for Immani to see the panic moving behind his eyes like something trapped and violent. Malik extended his hand again. "Turn around." This time Mercer moved, but not fast enough to look compliant. He turned with stiff, furious resistance, every inch of his posture broadcasting humiliation. One of the agents stepped forward with cuffs. Rex stayed still at Malik's side, but his attention never left Mercer. The dog's body coiled with the sort of trained restraint that made the entire moment feel even more final. Mercer heard the metallic click of the cuffs before they closed around his wrists, and that sound changed the street more than anything else had. Gasps rose. Someone muttered, "Lord." Another person whispered, "He's really done." The younger man across the street, still filming, said under his breath, half to himself and half to the people he knew would later watch the video, "They got him. They really got him." Mercer jerked once against the cuffs, a reflex more than a strategy. "You don't know who you're dealing with?" he snapped, twisting his head toward Malik. "This won't hold." Malik leaned just close enough for Mercer to hear him clearly. That line works best when the person saying it still has leverage. Mercer went still. Not calm. Never calm. But still in the way men do when rage has nowhere useful to go. The cuffs on his wrists looked obscene in their simplicity. No dramatic takedown. No screaming. No last-minute miracle. Just the cold, ordinary mechanics of accountability finally arriving. Behind him, one of the ICE officers. Icy hesitation still in his face, took a breath and stepped forward. It was Ruiz. His voice was tight when he spoke. "Sir, I need to make a statement." Every head turned. Mercer looked over his shoulder so fast it almost seemed painful. "Ruiz." The younger officer swallowed, his face pale under the streetlights, but he kept going. "He told us this was an internal lead. Said the paperwork would clear later. He said if anybody asked questions, he'd handle it." Ruiz's eyes flicked toward Immani, then away ashamed. He knew the boy was in there. A murmur of outrage passed through the crowd, like wind through dry leaves. That detail landed hard. Harder than some of the recordings, because it made the cruelty intimate, deliberate. Not just corruption in the abstract, but a conscious decision to terrorize a child. Mercer's voice turned savage. "You weak little—" Rex's growl cut through the street so low and sharp that Mercer's words died in his throat. The dog took one controlled step forward, enough to make the cuffs on Mercer's wrists suddenly look very necessary. It was not aggression. It was warning, pure and precise. The kind that comes from an animal trained to read danger faster than most people can speak it. For the first time all night, fear showed openly on Mercer's face. The crowd saw it too. It was a small thing maybe compared to everything else. A flicker in the eyes, a tightening in the mouth. But it was enough. Enough to satisfy something in the people watching. Enough to turn him from predator into prey in front of every witness he had counted on to stay passive. Miss Loretta spoke, then her voice shaking, not with fear now, but with fury. "You came to that woman's door like she was nothing. You touched that baby like he was property. Look at you now." Mercer didn't answer. He couldn't. Not because he had nothing to say, but because every possible response sounded smaller than the image of him standing there in handcuffs under the porch light. Immani felt Jaden slowly lift his face from her shoulder. His cheeks were wet. His breath still hitched now and then. But when he looked at Mercer, there was something different in his eyes now. Confusion still. Hurt still. But also the beginning of understanding that the man who had frightened him could bleed power too. That monsters were sometimes just cowards wearing official clothes. Malik turned slightly toward Immani, his posture easing by 1 degree. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "do you have the item he came for?" She looked down at Jaden. The boy looked back up at her, scared but trying very hard to be brave. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached into his small pocket and pulled out the pouch. The motion was so simple it almost broke her. That her son had understood. That he had protected it. That he had had to. His hand shook as he held it up. Immani took the pouch carefully, like it was made of glass, and for 1 second she could not speak. Tears rose hot and sudden, and this time she did not fight them. Her whole body was exhausted from holding itself together. Her heart ached with love, with terror, with relief so sharp it almost felt like pain. "You did good," she whispered to Jaden, her voice cracking. "You did so good." Malik accepted the pouch from her with both professionalism and care, as if he understood that he was not just taking evidence. He was taking 2 years of fear out of her hands. Mercer saw the exchange, and something in him broke loose at last. "You think that proves anything?" he shouted, twisting against the grip on his arms. "You think one drive changes anything? She's nothing." "She's..." Immani cut across him before she could think better of it. Her voice was raw but clear. "No. That's where you were wrong." The street went quiet again. She stepped forward 1 pace, Jaden still tucked behind her side, and looked Mercer directly in the eye. Not with rage, not with triumph, with truth. "You thought I was alone." The sentence hit him harder than her yelling ever could have, because it named the exact thing he had counted on from the beginning. Isolation. Fear. Silence. His whole system depended on women like her, believing nobody would come, nobody would listen, nobody would risk standing beside them once the badge and the threat were in the room. He had been wrong. Badly. Publicly. Permanently. And now everyone watching knew it. As the agents began walking Mercer toward the street, he stumbled once. It was a small thing. Barely more than a misstep on the edge of the curb. But after everything it felt symbolic. The man who had arrived at her door to break her life apart was leaving in cuffs, off balance, surrounded by witnesses. Justice did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looked like this: a neighborhood watching, a child still crying but safe, a woman still shaking but standing, and a cruel man finally learning what fear felt like. After Mercer was driven away, the street did not return to normal right away. Nights like that do not close neatly. They remain in the air, in the grass, in the faces of the people who witnessed them. For a long time after the vehicles pulled out, and the last flashing light disappeared. At the end of the block, neighbors stayed outside in small clusters, speaking in low voices, replaying what they had seen, as if saying it aloud might help their hearts catch up to reality. Miss Loretta crossed the yard slowly and stopped in front of Immani without a word at first. Then she reached out and took both of Immani's hands in hers. Her palms were warm and trembling. "You should never have had to stand there by yourself like that," she said softly. Immani looked down at their hands, then back up, tears still drying on her face. "I wasn't by myself," she replied. And this time when she said it, she believed it. Jaden had not let go of her all the way home, even though home was only a few steps away. Once the agents finished securing the house and Malik assured her quietly that nobody would be touching that door again without a warrant and a far different kind of authority, she took Jaden inside and sat with him on the couch under the same lamp that had once made the room feel so ordinary. Now nothing felt ordinary. Her body still shook now and then, not from present fear, but from the memory of it. Shock takes its time leaving. Jaden curled against her side, his face buried under her chin the way he had when he was younger. Children always return to the version of safety they remember best when the world scares them too deeply. "Are they gone?" he asked after a while, his voice small and tired. "They're gone," she whispered. "For real?" She swallowed, feeling her throat tighten again. "For real." He nodded, but she could tell from the way he stayed pressed against her that safety would need repeating for a while before it felt true again. Later that night, after Miss Loretta brought over tea, neither of them drank, and one of the female agents gently checked the red mark on Immani's wrist. Malik stepped into the doorway of the living room and waited until she looked up. He never crowded a room, never forced presence where it was not wanted. That was one of the reasons she had trusted him in the first place, even before trust felt wise. "It's done," he said. Immani looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "Not all the way." Malik nodded once. "Not all the way. But enough to make sure he can't come back here and pretend he still has power." That mattered more than she knew how to explain. People often talked about justice as if it arrived all at once, clean and complete like the final scene of a movie. But real justice came in layers. First survival, then proof, then protection. Then the long, difficult work of rebuilding a nervous system that had learned to expect violence at the door. Over the next few weeks, the story spread far beyond the neighborhood. The video from that night traveled faster than anyone expected, especially the moment Mercer laughed, while Jaden cried, and the moment Malik stepped out of the dark with Rex at his side and told him to take his hands off them. The recordings from the federal investigation followed. Other names surfaced. Other officers were suspended. 2 more arrests were made before the month was over. A local reporter stood in front of a courthouse and used phrases like abuse of power, coordinated misconduct, and federal witness intimidation. But the words that mattered most to Immani were far simpler. "We believe you. We saw what he did. You were right to speak." That was the thing corruption counted on most: silence. Not just legal silence, emotional silence, social silence, the kind that teaches people to doubt their own memory, because the people hurting them wear titles and uniforms and speak with the calm confidence of those who have never been challenged long enough to imagine losing. Mercer had counted on that. He no longer had the luxury. Jaden started sleeping through the night again after 2 weeks. Not every night. Some nights he still woke up with tears in his eyes and climbed into his mother's bed without a word. On those nights, Immani moved over, opened her arm, and let him settle against her heartbeat until morning. Healing did not ask permission, and it did not move in a straight line. It arrived in pieces, in full breaths, in one less flinch at the sound of a knock, in laughter returning without guilt. One Saturday afternoon, a month after the arrest, Jaden stood in the front yard, while Rex sat a few feet away, patient and alert, allowing the boy to hold out one shaking hand at a time, until fear gave way to wonder. Malik stood nearby, hands in his jacket pockets, watching without interruption. When Rex finally leaned forward and pressed his head gently against Jaden's palm, the boy smiled for the first time in a way that reached all the way into his eyes. Immani saw it from the porch and had to look away for a second, because her heart hurt with gratitude. Later, when Jaden ran inside to show Miss Loretta a photo one of the agents had printed for him, Immani stepped down from the porch and came to stand beside Malik. "You were right," she said. He glanced at her. "About what? That the truth doesn't disappear just because bad people are louder." Malik looked toward the yard where Rex had resumed his quiet post. "No," he said. "It just waits for the right moment to be protected." Immani let that settle. The afternoon light was warm. The street was quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. Not the kind built from fear. The kind built from survival after truth. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel alone. Moral lesson. Real justice does not begin when powerful people decide to care. It begins the moment someone refuses to bury the truth, even while shaking, even while afraid, even while standing alone. Fear can isolate people, but courage has a way of calling witnesses out of the shadows. And when truth is finally protected, healing becomes possible. If this story moved, you tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you believe the truth matters even when it takes time to rise, subscribe, and stay with us for the next story.